your child's progress on the goals and objectives in their IEP. So a regular report card is not going to address the specifics in the IEP. The progress report will. And the progress report is to keep you informed throughout the year whether or not your child is progressing in the way that is expected based on the supports and services that you've identified, because we don't want to wait for an entire IEP year to pass if something is not, if a child's not making progress in a particular area. We don't want to wait a whole year till we bring the team back together. If there's a progress report and the child's not making the expected progress, you can convene the team at any time to talk about that lack of expected progress and to talk about the need for more services. Equally, if a child makes a goal or benchmark early, we don't want to be continuing that goal or benchmark for the entire IEP period. We want to develop something new and revise it so that it's appropriate for the child. So it has both of those issues in it. Yes?
When you talk about you go through the whole process again every 3 years, who initiates that, the parent or the school?
The 3-year reevaluation process is initiated by the school.
Okay. Thank you.
You'll know, though, on the front cover of your IEP, the administrative sheet, it will say on there the time for the next 3-year reeval. And obviously, if you haven't been contacted, then you should reach out to the SPED coordinator and say, the 3-year reeval is coming up. You could say, I want to start it a little bit earlier, or you can say, I'm having some testing done on my own. I want to wait till we get that testing before you start. Because if you're having outside testing done, there's a lot of tests that can't be duplicated within a 12-month period, because one test will invalidate the results of the other. It's one of those things that if the child gets the same test twice within a certain period of time, it could impact the results, so they invalidate each other. It's almost like they had that practice effect of having it once. So you want to make sure you identify to the school, if your child's being evaluated around the same time they're doing the evaluations, what those tests are so that there is no duplication there. So I think we've made it through referral and evaluation in terms of what that process involves. You should know that if English is a second language, that everything should be provided to a parent in the language that they understand. So all information that goes to a parent, whether it's evaluations, consent forms, parents' rights brochures, they should all be in a language that's understood by the family. The family can also request an interpreter for an IEP meeting, which needs to be provided by the district, because the parent needs to have an opportunity for meaningful input into the IEP process for their child. And if that requires interpretation services or for information to be interpreted, then parents are entitled to that as well. So there's certain evaluations that are required, and there's certain evaluations that are really just dependent on whether or not it impacts an individual child. It's really every child is supposed to be evaluated in all areas related to their disability. So, if you have dyslexia, you're obviously going to look at reading, or, you're going to look at, most children should have a psychological evaluation, because that's going to look at their, it's going to look at intelligence, and what that's going to tell us is where the child's scoring in the area of intelligence to give us what their current individual potential is. That looks at 4 areas, and in addition to that, you have academic testing. And then the other areas that relate to suspected disability include a functional behavioral assessment, for children 14 and over, a vocational evaluation. Does your child need assistive technology? Is that something that the team should be looking at? So psychological, they say, is not required, but it's certainly something that you can request. And if it's something you haven't looked at by another provider, it might be something that you want to request for your child. So the school will generally do academic testing automatically. They might do a health assessment in terms of the school nurse. A lot of times a home assessment is done. But in terms of required assessments, it's really looking at the general curriculum, and what's outside that depends on the individual child. The IEP process prior to the meeting, as I said, you want to request your copies of your reports at least 2 days prior. And then when we get to the IEP process, at the team meeting itself, we're going to look at questions of eligibility first. So before anybody looks at developing an IEP, first we have to determine that the child is eligible in terms of having a disability, and then because of that disability, requiring specialized instruction or one or more related services. So, a disability. Has your child been diagnosed with a disability? You know, generally that would come from a doctor. A specific learning disability is something that can be identified through sort of academic testing. Not always, but sometimes. So the question is what is the disability and where did that information come from? Because schools are not really responsible for a diagnosis, and I think that we'd all agree there's certain levels of expertise and education that you'd want involved in any diagnosis of your child. So that's something to look at and have documented and submitted to the school. With regard to, does the child require special education services or one or more related services? That information is going to come from the evaluations. How is the child performing in the evaluations? Are they at the age level that's expected? What is their age? Are they at the grade level that they're at? You know, are they performing at the age and grade level that's expected of their non-typical peers? And that's what you want to look at. So you get evaluation results, you get scores on tests. The district has to have somebody at that meeting to explain those evaluation results to you. I know that a lot of them are very complicated, that we can do another workshop on just understanding evaluation results because they are that complicated, and how you read them and sort of when is your child below average, when is your child okay within that range. But someone needs to be able to interpret those results for you at the meeting so that you understand what it is. You know, so that's why I say you want to get the evaluations in advance. That way you can jot down questions. What does this score mean? What is this? They shouldn't give you just scores, though. They should also tell you whether or not, you know, in the narrative, if your child's performing at grade level, below grade level, significantly below grade level. But you might want to ask specific questions about those individual scores as well.
What does it mean when it says make a written request for copies of eval reports, including recommendations? What do you mean by that? What does it mean, recommendation?
Well, part of an evaluation itself is supposed to talk about if a child has specific needs, what the means are for meeting those needs, and that's what's referring to recommendations. Does the evaluation include any specific recommendations? And I have to tell you, as a matter, well, the regulation says, and the means of meeting those needs, I have to tell you that it's very common for recommendations not to be included in evaluations, and for the statement to be recommendations will be discussed at the team meeting, and people will say that they want to hear from the other evaluators first about their recommendations before they weigh in. It's certainly something that you can request, but I think it's an issue of disagreement in terms of what needs to be included because it is a team process. So questions of eligibility. First, does the child have a disability? There's a list here of specific types of disabilities. I will tell you that developmental delay generally applies to children from the age of 3 to 9 years of age. And then really what's expected is that by the time the child turns 9, is that we've been able to distinguish which other category they actually belong in. Developmental delay is really a catch-all, that if a child's not, you know, is below their peers, and whether it's academically, daily living skills, functionally, speech, that, you know, sometimes that they don't want to give it a specific diagnosis name, and what's expected is that by the time they turn 9 years old, you've been able to really narrow that focus and figure out specifically which type of impairment or disability the child fits into. I mean, it can be something, my daughter had the diagnosis of developmental delay until she was 9, and now because she's multiply handicapped, she has, you know, intellectual impairment, communication impairment, physical impairment. So, you know, but most kids won't have multiple ones, they'll have one. I just happen to have one of the more complicated children. The federal definition of autism, I think that's important for people to be able to refer to. In Massachusetts, the next slide talks about the fact that there is a specific law under Massachusetts that deals with children on the autism spectrum. People should become familiar with that because the rights of children on the autism spectrum in Massachusetts are much stronger than the federal law actually provides. We have a much stronger law in Massachusetts about about what children with autism teams are required to look at and address if a child is diagnosed on the spectrum. That's certainly information that we can put on our website for parents to access. We can provide the link to not only that section of the law, but also there's a detailed memorandum put out by the Department of Education that talks about what teams are supposed to do if your child has autism in terms of addressing their communication needs, looking at whether they have sensory issues, behavioral needs. I mean, it goes through a whole list that the team is supposed to address. And it's only been around for a few years now, but it is a specific law in Massachusetts that addresses children on the autism spectrum. So, yes?
PDNOS as well?
Yes, that's part of autism spectrum disorder. Yes?
Just to back up a couple slides, you have ADHD listed as a health impairment as opposed to a neurological condition? Is that
Yes,
how
the
it's-
law defines that as a health impairment, ADHD.
And is there any real consequence as to why it's under health as opposed to like neurological?
No, I mean, I think that's just a matter of, you know, realistically speaking, what disability isn't related to a neurological functioning because everything flows from the brain. But to help, you know, it's just, it doesn't really matter which category you're under, you just need to have a disability and need special education or related services. I didn't write the definition, but they captured it under health impairment. It could be because medically it can be treated in some ways and effectively for some children, you know, in terms of medications. You know, that's a parental choice, but they put it under health impairment.
And did I miss something that says under special learning disabilities, new evaluation procedures? Did you, is there anything you're aware of there that's?
When you do a specific, under a specific learning disability, the new evaluation procedures is that you have to fill out specific forms during the team process that you identify the area of a specific learning disability. You know, it's not you have a specific learning disability and it covers everything. You can have a specific learning disability in reading. You can have a disorder of written expression. You can have, you know.
So it's gotten more specific.
It's gotten more specific and the team is required to document it more thoroughly. So the procedures really relates to the issue of the paperwork.
And sort of, this all applies to both an initial evaluation and your ongoing progress IEP meetings. It's all pretty much the same regulation, the same, I mean, it's really clear in terms of what you're doing an initial evaluation, you know, you need all this stuff, but all these issues really, for example, if they've instituted new evaluation procedures since your original evaluation or since your last 3-year evaluation, are they supposed to catch up with it right away, or are they going to wait for the next?
No, it's when the next IEP meeting is. So it wouldn't be retroactive, it would be in the next process. They would implement the
You
new
should typically have
procedures.
at least one a year, I would think.
Right,
Yeah.
an annual meeting is supposed to occur, is required to occur once a year, yes. But you can also convene the team at any time, and that's because, as I said before, sometimes during a child's, you know, educational process within a year's time, issues can reveal themselves that weren't otherwise known to the team. So you can request an evaluation in a specific area that's you know, become revealed, or that has increased even, you know, that maybe wasn't looked at in a specific way. You're not limited to the 1 year and the 3 year. You can convene the team at any time. You can bring up an issue at any time. It's supposed to be an ongoing dialogue, but what they do require is that you have at least an annual meeting and at least a reevaluation every 3 years. So the Massachusetts Autism Law, this slide actually neatly lists the 7 areas that the team is required to look at. But again, we'll post the copy of the DOE memo because I think it's helpful to have. Obviously, we try to provide as much information as we can, but the amount of paperwork involved for so many people is pretty daunting. So we're trying to facilitate as much information as we can And quite frankly, I like to have them on my computer anyway, because you can go, you know, once you open the link, you can save it as one of your favorites, and then you can refer to it, because I don't know about you, but every time I print one out, then I can't find it when I'm looking for it, so that's a helpful thing to use, so. Federal definition of emotional disturbance and medical illness, I think that people want to focus on that feel that it impacts their individual child. I'm not going to spend time on it just in terms of going through what that means. It's really taken from the federal regulation. So that information is there. If you think that's something that impacts your child, you should know that that information is supported in those positions. So, you know, it's also something if your child has an emotional disturbance or a medical mental illness, that you would be involved with medical professionals to help with the diagnosis and treatment of that, not just special education, because that's a more detailed or expert evaluation, I would say, in terms of the person that you want dealing with that. So questions of not making effective progress in school due to the disability. That's, again, what you look at in terms of, is the child making effective progress? And if your child's making effective progress, first of all, it needs to be in accordance with the child's individual potential. So, you know, my child's individual potential would not be the same as your child's individual potential based on what my child's disability is and how severely she's impacted. I wouldn't have the same expectations of a child in her class that had dyslexia because she's multiply handicapped, she has a lot more issues. I wouldn't be expecting her to be able to close that gap, you know, with the child that she's, you know, has a disability but has a completely different type of disability. So you really want to look at what the individual potential is of the child. And then you also want to be looking at sort of what are the other areas it needs in terms of what is the social growth expected for that age and grade level? You know, what is the growth in that area? Is that something that needs to be addressed in the IEP? And is your child able to make progress in the general education curriculum with accommodations and modifications? And some people will say, well, if they're making progress, then they no longer require special education. That's not actually true. You expect a child to make progress under their IEP with the supports and services that they're receiving. The question is do they continue to need those supports and services in order to continue to make effective progress? So, you know, you'll teach children compensatory strategies, meaning that while they're working on sort of learning how to spell or increasing their spelling skills, you might let them use an Alpha Smart tool so that they can check their spelling and the computer does it for them. So the compensatory means it's a support in place while they're working on the skill that needs to be increased. So if the child can now spell on their own, then you're going to say, okay, well they no longer need that accommodation, right? Or they're now spelling on grade level and they don't need any support to be able to do that day in and day out. Then they're not going to continue to need services in that area. If they were getting pull-out services to work with, you know, a special educator to work on that. But if the child can't continue to make progress once you take those supports away, you know, is the progress reliant on those supports? Because we don't want to take the supports away if that's why the child's making progress. I hope that makes sense. But it's almost like if they can do it on their own, great. But if those supports are what's helping them do it, you don't take the supports away. It's sort of like you don't take the crutches away until you can actually walk, because you're just going to fall flat on your face, and then we'll be reconvening the team to address those issues.
When the child turns 14, after that, is the support stop, or is for any reason the child shows some progress, but we believe that need to continue having, you know, the support, do they continue, or until what age?
Okay, the question was if a child turns 14, do the services stop? No, there's no determination that's based on age. Children can be eligible for special education services from the age of 3 to the age of 22. Whether or not a child continues to need special education services or related services is based on the information for that individual child, based on their progress and based on their evaluation reports. So there's no cutoff at age 14. In fact, since you brought up age 14, I'm going to say that when a child turns age 14, the team now needs to look at the issue of transition services. So that's when you want to be asking for a transition assessment or a vocational assessment, because now we want to be looking at adult life and sort of future education, employment, independent living, you know, in terms of going out and being able to do banking, shopping at the grocery store, taking public transportation, things of those nature start to come into play as the child gets older. But there is no end of services when a child turns 14. Okay, so, again, we're still on question of eligibility. So just in terms of the slides, so again, it's saying to address the child's individual needs, what does that child needs in terms of how they're it's not just having a disability, but it's how that disability impacts the child. And what we want to do is give that child the supports and services that they need in order to access and make progress in the general education curriculum in any other areas impacted by their disability. Whether their behavior is impacted by their disability, their social skills are impacted by their disability. The next slide on page 11 at the top lists out areas of related services. So it's not constrained by a list. You can see in small print it says travel training. That would be something under, you know, if a child, first of all, if they were visually impaired, they might need orientation and mobility, including travel training in terms of accessing transportation. But travel training in terms of independence could involve learning how to buy a Charlie car, learning how to go onto the website and access the MBTA schedule, and mapping out your, you know, your route, and then learning what stop you get on at, what stop you get off. All of those things can be part of the child's IEP if it's necessary in order for that child to make progress in those areas impacted by their disability. Okay, so that's, yep.
Who does all this training? Is it the parents or the child? Like the travel training?
Oh, this is part of the special education services under the IEP, which starting at age 14 becomes transition planning.
What I'm saying is, who does?
The question was, who does the travel training? A lot of kids will go out with their special educators and take a trip on the MBTA. You know, it's under the IEP, who's designated to provide that service, because part of the IEP talks about not only what the service is, but also who's responsible for providing that service and how often they're supposed to provide that service.
I don't recall seeing it.
Okay. It may not be, but that would be a question you can put on the index card for me to address specifically with you if there's an issue with it. Because if it's something that your child needs and it's not in their IEP, you want to follow up with that.
I think it's more than just
My question is going to be, when they turn 14 and you switch over to the transition,
You don't switch over transition. What it is when your child turns 14, transition comes up, and it now is included with it. So you'll have an IEP, and then you'll also have a transition planning form. So in addition to the IEP, you have a transition plan.
okay, so they still would follow the same IEP and academic goals,
Yes.
and the transition would just be added, like the same
Yeah,
way
it's
they
basically
add-
saying once the child turns 14, we want to start to look at the future, and we want to start to plan ahead. So the transition planning form is planning for the transition into adulthood. So in Massachusetts, it's required to start, it used to be 16, they changed the law, so now they want people planning earlier and starting at age 14. So it's in addition to, it's not one or the other.
Okay.
But I can't say that, you know, I always have to go back to, but what does your child need? You know what I mean? Some children will need a whole host of transition services. Others may not need any, you know, so it's really a team process. And it's supposed to be based on the child's interests and preferences, because if you're going to look at job opportunities and sort of a job coach or job shadowing, you know, you're not going to pick a job that the child hates that area, you know, like say if it's working in a retail store, but they hate clothes and they don't even like to go shopping. Well, you wouldn't pick that as something. So what do you want to do? You know, not video games, but I'm just saying, you know, stuff that's actually going to provide them with a source of income. Huh?
So video games could be a very good video game maker.
No, I know, I just meant it's not leisure time, it's to prepare them by getting those pre-work skills, you know? I mean, some kids are gonna need to learn how to fill out a job application, to write a resume, you know, you can go online, and, I mean, I think, I'm much older now, but I think a lot of the applications are now online, and you have to do it that way, and so you wanna be able to, you know, you need computer skills to be able to do that and save that information and not lose it, and, you know, so there's a whole host of skills that come into play as they get older that you want to make sure are addressed if it's appropriate for your child. Yes, sir?
I'm sorry to bring you back to the definition. I have a question from there. I think the whole last week, I have heard through the television and there's NCR radio that the definition of autism is going to change. I don't know if you mentioned it earlier, I came back.
No, that's actually, it's not part of this, I mean, I'll touch on it for a minute because I've heard about it as well, but the definition of autism is something that's developed by doctors, and it's in the DSM-B manual, which really is, you know, they're talking about the fact that they're going to change the definition of that, which will ultimately exclude some children. But I'm actually just going to be honest, I don't have the knowledge or expertise to comment on that process because it's really something that's, you know, it's in the field of neuropsychologists and psychologists that they develop those sort of the standards, if you will. And I think the standard has to do with the definition and what criteria is going to be necessary in order for you to fall under the definition of autism. But it's not changed yet, so so far I don't think there's anything for us to respond to. And obviously with regard to the definition overall, I'm sure there'll be a lot of discussion and a lot of debate as that moves forward to address the issue.
And I've also heard, just quickly, I mean, there is a lot of discussion going on, especially if you go to Autism Speaks or any of those sites, but they are, what I have heard is that children who would be excluded, like my son with PDD, NOS or whatever, would probably be moved to a different criteria in there, so they wouldn't be excluded completely. So, and it's still way too early to say anything about.
Although the Autism Society, we're having a webinar on that topic.
Thank you.
I mean, what I mean is, if you guys know now already,
Oh, we'll certainly share that information, yes, absolutely.
I've heard from one of the doctors, I believe from the Children's Hospital, the female doctor. She's been saying almost the same thing that you said, but she said, from the definitions, some of the disability should be probably get rid of from there, and all the services will be go with that, so these kids will not get any services. So, but she said in Boston, most of, she thinks almost all kids will have these services, but if you guys know beforehand, so that will be able to...
Oh, yes, absolutely. I mean, we have you know, a lot of interest, obviously, in protecting the rights of our children and making sure that they're not denied services, because there's no parent that wants special education services that their child doesn't need. None of us, you know, wanted to go down this journey at all. So, I mean, obviously, to the extent that we can identify concerns while they're happening, share that information with parents, and obviously have an opportunity to weigh in on that outcome, we will certainly do that. So, and I know that there's a number of parents that are involved in SPEDPAC that have children on the autism spectrum, and I know that they're keeping a close eye on that. So we will share information as we learn about it, okay?